Hello, and welcome to tonight's special episode of Untold Stories, Bravery in Burma. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. I can see in our comment section that we already have a lot of friends letting us know where they are streaming in from, but if you're new here, if you could put down in the chat where you're streaming in from, I always love to see where all of our audience members are tuning in from. I want to remind everybody, if you haven't heard yet, we have a really special travel opportunity coming up this summer. We have put together a tour with Trident Expeditions to take guests all the way out to the Pacific to commemorate the ending of World War II. So sites will include Hawaii, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And we're going to drop a link into the chat in just a little bit so that you can, if you're interested, learn more about this opportunity. I know probably the first question is, when is it? So the dates for this amazing trip are going to be July 30th through August 10th. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speakers for tonight. If you can believe it, they are streaming in all the way over from the UK. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Tonight we are joined by Doug Henderson and Daren Bowyer of the Gurkha Museum. So I'd like to go ahead and hand the program over to them so they can do their wonderful presentation.
Lauren, thank you very much. And Ron, thank you for getting us through the hurdle of getting the tech set up. Good evening, everyone, or perhaps more correctly, I should say good morning, as it is now 3 minutes past midnight on the 9th of May over here in the UK. I'm Daren Bowyer, Director at the Gurkha Museum, and I'm joined by Doug Henderson, our Assistant Curator. It is an absolute pleasure, despite the hour, to be speaking to you today, or yesterday. I can only dream of the day when small military museums have sufficient budget to allow us to visit in person. Not least as a wonderful colleague from my service in the US headquarters in Kabul some years ago lives just a couple of hours away, and it would be great to visit. The Gurkha Museum, I should point out, is a UK registered charity receiving limited financial support from the UK government and having to raise the rest of our funds itself with, I must say, outstanding support from the Serving Brigade of Gurkhas and from its veterans. Time precludes me saying very much by way of introduction to the Gurkhas, so let me just say that a relationship that started in conflict at the Anglo-Nepal War of 1814 to 16 developed into one of the closest and most enduring friendships between nations on opposite sides of the world, and to over 200 years of loyal and valiant Gurkha service to the British Crown, which is still continuing today. There are many examples of Gurkha bravery from the Burma campaigns, but as it is the 80th anniversary, our focus this evening is on the 1945 campaign to finally push the Japanese out of Burma. And specifically, we're going to talk about the actions of just two Gurkha winners of the Victoria Cross, the United Kingdom's highest award for valor and gallantry. Riflemen's Bhanbhagta Gurung of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles and Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. I'm going to start with an attempt to put the campaign in the context of the war. Doug's then going to give an overview of the situation at the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945, and General Bill Slim's plans, and then each of us will focus on those two brave soldiers and the actions that saw them awarded Britain's highest decoration for valour. So in December 1941, the Second World War became truly global. On the 7th of December, Japan firstly attacked the United States Pacific Fleet and its base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then declared war on both the United States and the British Empire. Hong Kong was attacked the following day, surrendering 2 weeks later on Christmas Day. In concert with the attacks on Pearl Harbor and on Hong Kong, Japanese forces also landed troops in the Philippines, in Malaya, and on northern Borneo. The Japanese had, of course, already occupied French Indochina in 1940 and had been fighting China since 1937. The Japanese plan in the Pacific was to secure and safeguard the raw materials it needed for the war, especially oil and rubber, and to create a fortified perimeter around an economically self-sufficient Japan, able to last out until the Allies were exhausted. Having made their initial landings in northern Malaya on the 8th of December 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops quickly broke through British and British Indian Army defensive positions and pushed down the west coast of the Malayan Peninsula, making rapid advances through the jungle, in part through the use of bicycle-mounted infantry. Although the Royal Engineers destroyed over 100 bridges as British forces retreated, it was to little avail. And by the 25th of January 1942, the Japanese had fought their way to Singapore, Britain's major military base in the Far East. Among the British forces fighting in that retreat down the Malay Peninsula was 28th Indian Infantry Brigade, comprising the 2nd Battalions of each of 1st Gurkha Rifles, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, and the 9th Gurkha Rifles. By the time Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered on the 15th of February 1942, Allied losses totaled more than 130,000, including 7,500 to 8,000 killed, more than 11,000 wounded, and more than 120,000 missing or captured. By contrast, Japanese casualties were fewer than 15,000. Winston Churchill described the fall of Singapore as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. More or less simultaneously with the invasion of the Malay Peninsula and having secured an armistice with Thailand, Japanese forces invaded British Burma. Having previously been administered by Britain as part of her Indian Empire, Burma had since 1935 been administered as a separate colony. There was a growing pressure for independence, and after the Japanese attack, the fledgling independence movement grew apace into the Burma Independence Army, in which Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, and often referred to in Myanmar as father of the nation, served prominently. So although later in the campaign the Burmese in the north would offer significant help, the British defenders could count on little support from much of the Burmese population and often faced open hostility. As the possibility of land invasion had largely been discounted for much the same reason as it had in Malaya and Singapore, defences were limited and not in a good state. British resistance in early 1942 was ineffective, and by March, the capital, along with its vital port, had fallen to the Japanese. Allied forces, including a significant number of Gurkha battalions, 5 of them in 17th Indian Division alone, conducted a fighting retreat over 1,000 miles across awful terrain and often in very poor weather. Early phases of the withdrawal included the disastrous action portrayed here at the Sitang Railway Bridge, when the controversial, though almost certainly essential, decision was taken by the GOC 17th Indian Division, Major General Jackie Smith, Victoria Cross, to blow the bridge, while the majority of the division's fighting units were still on the enemy side of the river. As well as many fatalities, this resulted in huge numbers of prisoners taken into what would turn out to be brutal Japanese captivity. Many more were drowned in the Sitang as they valiantly tried to swim or raft the river. Rangoon and the whole of southern Burma were soon in enemy hands. Smith was sacked for his handling of the defence of the Sitang. It was to try and create order from the chaos that in March 1914, Burma Corps, Corps as it became known, was formed under the command of the recently arrived and newly promoted acting Lieutenant General William Bill Slim. Remaining units were grouped into 2 divisions. 17th Indian, now under command of another Gurkha officer, Major General Punch Cowan, and the 1st Burma Division, commanded by yet another famous Gurkha officer, Major General James Bruce Scott, incidentally one of the early pioneers of climbing Mount Everest. While the Burma campaign was quite clearly a defeat, with a most significant loss not just of lives, but of motor transport and other equipment as well, British forces were able to destroy the important Yang oil fields and most of their equipment to prevent it falling into enemy hands. Under Slim's quite inspirational leadership, Burma Corps retreated battered, bruised, but still as an organised and disciplined fighting force that had managed to land some blows on the Japanese and to avoid their withdrawal becoming a disorganised rout. By mid-May 1942, they had reached India, where it must be said their initial reception was quite appalling. They were in relatively good order and at least in a position from which they could be reformed and reconstituted. They had won a lethal race against both the Japanese and the monsoon rains. By the end of May, Burr Corps had been disbanded and its operational units handed to 4th Corps, then commanded by Acting Lieutenant General Noel Irwin. Irwin and Slim had already clashed when Irwin, whose corps were responsible for receiving the remains of Burr Corps as they arrived back in India, had received them so badly and dismissively of everything they had achieved. Irwin was subsequently moved to India's Eastern Command with overall responsibility for North East India and Burma, and 4th Corps was given to Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoones, who would command it until 1945, including for the iconic and impressive defensive battle at Imphal. With Burr Corps disbanded, Slim was handed command of 15 Corps, charged with defending Bengal, maintaining internal security there, and training new recruits. It was with 15 Corps that Slim, building on his experience retreating through Burma, began to frame his philosophy for hitting back at the Japanese. The jungle should no longer be seen, as it had previously by Allied forces, as impenetrable, but rather as the Japanese had seen it, a source of concealed manoeuvre and surprise. If the enemy is behind you, mused Slim, then it is he and not you who is surrounded. The jungle could and should be used, not avoided. Tanks could be used almost anywhere, but which should always be used in strength, and keeping the initiative was key. Slim's training regime was interrupted when, under pressure from Winston Churchill, Wavell, the commander-in-chief in India, ordered General Irwin's Eastern Command forward into the Burmese coastal province of Arakan, now Rakhine. The main teeth of the offensive would come from 14th Indian Division, which, although theoretically part of Slim's 15 Corps, would be commanded directly by Irwin's HQ. Only when things were already going badly, probably irretrievably so, did Irwin reinsert Slim and 15 Corps headquarters into the chain of command. Placing blame for the failure firmly and unfairly on Slim, in May 1943, Irwin wired Slim to tell him he was relieved of command. However, Irwin was himself almost immediately sacked and replaced by General George Gifford. Irwin subsequently wired Slim again. "You are not sacked, I am," read the signal. Slim's relationship with Gifford was altogether better, and they formed a very successful working relationship. Later that year, recognising what Slim had achieved in the retreat from Burma, and then preparing his new corps for operations, in October he was given command of 14th Army. The autumn and winter of 1943 saw Allied forces taking the offensive. A second assault on the Arakan. Stilwell's US-Chinese force pressuring the Japanese from the northeast, and the Chindits causing havoc behind Japanese lines. By the beginning of 1944, the war was not going well for Japan. They were being forced back in the Southwest Pacific, and their merchant shipping was under relentless and constant assault from Allied submarines and aircraft. In the Southeast Asia theatre, the Allies were planning attacks into Burma from the Chinese province of Yunnan and from Manipur in northeast India. And it was against this background that Lieutenant General Mutaguchi, commanding Japan's 15th Army, planned his attack on the major Allied supply base at Imphal and its links to the larger base at Dimapur. Time precludes more than a brief mention of those key battles at Imphal and Kohima, but the valiant defence by Slim's 14th Army, and especially Scoones' 4 Corps, with significant Gurkha contribution, set the condition for the invasion of Burma, about which Doug is now going to speak.
Thank you, Dan. By June 1944, plans were being drawn up to take advantage of the victories at Kohima and Imphal and begin the reconquest of Burma proper. In contrast to the initial concepts of Burmese recapture, which focused on attacks in the south and the Arakan, it was determined the reconquest would now best be achieved by a land advance into central Burma. This would cut off the remaining Japanese troops in the north from support and avoid a direct amphibious assault on the Japanese command at Rangoon in the south, which was then unfeasible due to Allied landing craft and amphibious resources being diverted towards the liberation of Europe. This offensive into central Burma would be performed by the 14th Army, led by General Slim, and supported by renewed offensives by the British 15th Corps in the Arakan region to the south. The differing terrain of central Burma, much flatter and more open than the difficult jungles in the north, meant that armour and speed would play a much greater role in the coming stages of the war, adding to the existing logistical problems faced by the 14th Army. Poor roads and access routes would cause delays and slow down any advance or resupply. General Slim's assumption was that the opposing Japanese forces would do their best to slow down the Allied advance right from the start, with serious fighting occurring before reaching the Irrawaddy River. Operations began in late 1944 as the monsoon rains ended. In November, Allied troops secured 2 bridgeheads across the Chindwin River into Burma proper, and on November 29th and December 4th, respectively, the 19th Division, known as the Dagger Division, and the 20th Indian Infantry Division, containing between them 8 battalions of Gurkhas, began their advances. Contrary to Slim's assumptions, their advances were extremely rapid. The Japanese had instead decided to withdraw beyond the Irrawaddy and fight from behind it, using it as an obstacle. Seeing this, the Allied plan was rapidly changed on the move, and the entire Allied 4th Corps switched its focus to advance down the Gangor Valley to the west of the Chindwin River, whilst the Indian 33rd Corps would continue with the original plan and advance towards the historic city of Mandalay, of Road 2 fame. Slim hoped that the 33rd Corps would provide enough of a distraction for his 4th Corps to deliver a stunning armoured right hook attack 150 kilometres to the southwest against the supply point of Meiktila. Located on the important north-south road to Rangoon, housing a key railway junction, and being near local airfields, the city of Meiktila was a vital hub of Japanese communications in the region. To convince Japanese intelligence that the main thrust was still coming from 33rd Corps, a detailed deception plan was set into motion. This involved the creation of a dummy 4th Corps headquarters on the Mandalay front, transmitting misleading radio traffic, and the screening of the heavy armour of 4th Corps during its advance using lighter infantry units. On January 14, 1945, Allied troops crossed the Irrawaddy River in the north, but they faced serious resistance further downriver. Crossings there required much more involved preparation, and after weeks of having small beachheads counterattacked nightly by Japanese troops, the Allies were eventually able to gain more of a foothold. In early February, the 7th Indian Division, the tip of the spear of the 4th Corps' advance, began its crossing at a site known as Pakoku. A brutal series of engagements occurs, as heavy tanks, artillery and soldiers exchanged fire attempting to cross the river. Allied air superiority during this phase played a decisive role, knocking out field guns and the few remaining Japanese tanks. After taking heavy casualties, the 7th Division established a beachhead, and by February 17th, brigade after brigade were crossing the river. Once across the river, the focus on Meiktila intensified. The 17th Division, led, as Daren has previously mentioned, by Major General David Punch Cowan, containing troops from the 7th and 10th Gurkhas and colloquially known as the Black Cats, charged straight forward for their targets. By the 26th of February, the division had reached and captured Meiktila's outskirts. The nearby airfield at Tabutcon was quickly taken, and the 99th Indian Brigade and additional fuel supplies were called in immediately. Meiktila itself was defended for the most part by men of the Japanese 168th Regiment, with additional manpower from various support and rear-line units, totaling about 4,000 soldiers. 2 days later, the main attack on these forces commenced, intending to envelop the city from all sides. However, the Japanese were well entrenched in the city, Snipers, mutually reinforcing bunkers, machine gun nests, and anti-tank positions were all heavily deployed against the advancing Allied brigades. The 48th Brigade, led in the vanguard by the 1st Battalion of the 7th Gurkha Rifles, attacked from the north, whilst the 63rd Brigade, led by the 1st Battalion of the 10th Gurkha Rifles, attacked from the west, and the 255th Tank Brigade swept around in an arc from the north and engaged the city from the east. 1st Battalion 7th Gurkhas began their assaults skirting north of the lake, close to the city, known as Meiktila Lake, where they encountered immediate heavy resistance from the Japanese defenders, who had mined the approaches to the area. A Company of the 1st 7th Gurkhas helped clear this resistance, whilst B and C companies fought to the northern outskirts of the town, only to be pinned down by heavy machine gun and artillery fire. As darkness fell, the decision was taken to withdraw that night and attack again the following morning. As the sun rose, A and D companies tactically drove forward and successfully cleared their way towards their objective, the hub of communications in the town, the Meiktila railway station. 1st Battalion 10th Gurkhas, for their part, led the 63rd Brigade, as I have mentioned, in their assault to the west and to the south of the lake itself. By the evening of March 2nd, the whole of the west of Meiktila was in that battalion's hands. General Slim himself was incidentally a former officer of the 6th and 7th Gurkha Rifles during the interwar years, and he would later comment on the actions of the Gurkhas at the Battle of Meiktila in the following terms. Quote, "Suddenly, 3 Gurkhas sprang up simultaneously and dashed forward. One fell, but the 2 others covered the remaining yards to their nearest bunker and thrust Tommy guns through their loopholes. Behind them surged an uneven line of their comrades, and another line broke from a nearby spinney, bayonets glinting. They swarmed around the bunkers, and for a moment, all firing ceased." And Slim ends the quote rather diplomatically there, but I leave it to your own imaginations to imagine the sounds and fury that would have filled that silence from the Gurkhas. By March 5th, Meiktila had fallen. However, the elation at capture was to be short-lived, as Japanese reinforcements that had all been hastily called in to support the Japanese garrison now began arriving in large numbers, and they launched assaults to try and recapture the now lost city. The arriving Japanese 18th and 49th Divisions, along with more composite units, composed about 12,000 soldiers to go toe-to-toe with the now 15,000 Allied 17th Division, finding themselves walled into the city itself. An initial breakout attempt failed, and so the 17th Division was forced back to the city, and a state of siege began. The first attacks on Meiktila by the Japanese failed with heavy losses, but then they changed their tactics. They diverted from attacking the city itself to its nearby airfields. It was hoped that this would prevent resupply to the city and would eventually force the defenders to capitulate. This was partially successful. By March 18th, General Cowan had to call off supply runs to the airfields due to dangers to the aircrew. But by the end of March, plagued by poor inter-unit communications and a very high attrition rate amongst their remaining tanks and artillery, the Japanese siege of Meiktila gradually fell apart. And I'll hand back to Daren to go from the general to the particular in one particular instance.
So although the plan that would have seen amphibious assaults on the Arakan as the main effort of the attack into Burma was abandoned, as Doug said, for the lack of the essential resources for littoral warfare, the plans were partially taken forward in late 44, early 45, to support 14th Army with its thrust into central Burma. Central to the plan was for Slim's old corps, the 15th, directly subordinate to Southeast Asia Command, to seize the Arakan and secure or construct airfields from which 14th Army could be supported. Once the monsoon had ended in late 1944, 15th Corps had resumed, for the 3rd year running, an attack on Akyab Island, which the Japanese finally abandoned on the 31st of December 1944. 2 days later, it was occupied by 15th Corps. A significant foothold had been established. Then further up the Arakan coast, Gurkhas were to receive their penultimate Victoria Cross of the war. In February 1945, 3rd Battalion of 2nd King Edward VII's own Gurkha Rifles had advanced to the village of Tamandu. The road ahead was dominated by a hill feature known as Snowdon, and 3rd 2nd Gurkha Rifles were detailed to capture it to allow units of the 82nd West African Division safely to evacuate some of their casualties. Initially, the hill was occupied without opposition, but overnight, on the 4th of March, the Japanese retook the neighbouring hill known as Snowdon East. B Company, 3rd 2nd GR, were detailed to retake that feature, and during their attack, while subject to withering enemy fire, Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung took part in actions for which he would be awarded the Victoria Cross. Born in September 1921 in Phalpur in the Gurkha district of Nepal, Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung joined the 3rd Battalion, 2nd King Edward VII's Zone Gurkha Rifles in 1940, subsequently seeing service in the first Chindit operation, Operation Longcloth, in 1943. In 1944, having obtained the rank of Naik Corporal, he was reduced to the rank of Rifleman for an error that turned out not to have been his fault. Although he was considered not to bear a grudge for this, perhaps nevertheless it drove his determination to prove himself in what came next. Whatever the motivation, Bhanbhagta fought like a man possessed, utilising rifle, grenades, smoke, and of course his kukri. I now quote from his citation. On the 5th of March 1945, a company of 2nd Gurkha Rifles attacked an enemy position known as Snowdon East. On approaching the objective, one of the sections was forced to ground by heavy machine gun fire, grenade and mortar fire. And owing to the severity of this fire, it was unable to move in any direction. Whilst thus pinned, the section came under accurate fire from a tree sniper, some 75 yards to the south. As the sniper was inflicting casualties on the section, Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung, being unable to fire from the lying position, stood up, fully exposed to the heavy fire, and calmly killed the enemy sniper with his rifle, thus saving his section from suffering any further casualties. The section advanced again, but when within 20 yards of the objective, were again attacked by heavy fire. Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung, without waiting for any orders, dashed forward alone and attacked the first enemy foxhole. Throwing 2 grenades, he killed the 2 occupants, and without any hesitation rushed on to the next enemy foxhole and killed the Japanese in it with his bayonet. 2 further enemy foxholes were bringing fire to bear on the section, and again Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung dashed forward alone and cleared these with bayonet and grenade. During his single-handed attacks on these 4 enemy foxholes, Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung was subjected to almost continuous and point-blank light machine gun fire from a bunker on the north tip of the objective. Realising that this light machine gun would hold up not only his own platoon, which was now behind him, but also another platoon advancing from the west, Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung for the 5th time went forward alone in the face of heavy enemy fire to knock out the position. He doubled forward, leapt onto the roof of the bunker, and from where his hand grenades being finished, he flung 2 number 77 smoke grenades into the bunker slit. 2 Japanese rushed out of the bunker, partially blinded by the smoke. Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung promptly killed them both with his kukri. A remaining Japanese inside the bunker was still firing the light machine gun and holding up the advance of number 4 platoon. So Bhanbhagta Gurung crawled inside the bunker, killed the Japanese gunner, captured the light machine gun. Most of the objective had now been cleared by the men behind, and the enemy driven off were collecting for a counterattack beneath the north end of the objective. Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung ordered the nearest brain gunner and 2 riflemen to take up positions in the captured bunker. The enemy counterattack followed soon after, but under Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung's command, the small party inside the bunker repelled it with heavy loss to the enemy. Rifleman Bhanbhagta Gurung showed outstanding bravery and a complete disregard for his own safety. His courageous clearing of 5 enemy positions single-handed was itself decisive in capturing the objective, and his inspiring example to the rest of the company contributed to the speedy consolidation of his success. Can there be any better script for a boy's own comic, or indeed for a Victoria Cross citation? In addition to Bhanbhagta's VC, 2nd Gurkha Rifles was recognised by the award of Tamandu as a battle honour. Tamandu Day was celebrated by the regiment until its amalgamation into the Royal Gurkha Rifles in 1994. In August 2020, to mark BJ 75, Rifleman Bhanbhagta's grandson, Captain Buddy, visited the museum and saw his grandfather's Victoria Cross for the first time. Bhanbhagta's VC is one of the 10 owned or on permanent loan to the Gurkha Museum, but one of 7 currently in secure storage. As part of Project Qaida, our ambitious redevelopment project, which I shall mention later, our plan is that all 10 of these Victoria Crosses will be on display here at the museum.
Thank you, Darren. Meanwhile, to return back to our narrative of the wider campaign, on the Mandalay front, the 19th Indian Division had spent much of January and February clearing the Irrawaddy River of opposing Japanese forces. By March, it was making rapid progress against an increasingly weak Japanese 15th Division. By March 7th, the outlying units of the 19th Division were within sight of Mandalay Hill. The prospective loss of Mandalay was seen by both sides as a massive blow to Japanese prestige, as well as a logistical nightmare due to the large numbers of supplies the town still held, and so it was feared the Allied attackers would face fanatical resistance. Nevertheless, on March 8th, the 4th Battalion of the 4th Gurkha Rifles began to advance on Mandalay Hill. Mandalay Hill was not bombarded beforehand due to the presence of many ancient and culturally significant temples and pagodas dotted all over its slopes. And so the hill had been turned into an underground maze of tunnels and choke points by its defenders. It was considered to be a very tough nut to crack. However, in actuality, the Japanese only managed to hold out for less than a week before being forced to fall back by the Gurkhas' advance. In the city of Mandalay itself, stiff resistance was encountered at the 30-foot-high, 4-foot-thick walls of Fort Dufferin, a former Burmese royal palace and then later centre of British control over the town itself, surrounded by a moat which resisted even dambuster-style attempts to skip bombs over it to reach the walls. It proved incredibly difficult to breach. For 10 days, the 1st and 4th Battalions of the 6th Gurkha Rifles engaged in bitter street fighting in the areas surrounding the fort, until the Japanese forces managed to withdraw on the night of March 19th, leaving the city in Allied hands. The capture of the city was celebrated on March 21st by the hoisting of a Union Jack over Fort Dufferin for the first time since its capture, at a ceremony presided over by General Slim himself. With Mandalay captured, the siege of Meiktila collapsing, being officially called off at the end of March, and other Allied bridgeheads across the Irrawaddy being consolidated as more and more troops poured into the region, the Japanese response became weaker and more fragmentary. Smaller and smaller groups of Japanese soldiers broke off and attempted to desperately regroup south and to the east. Despite these hopes of withdrawal, however, the defeat of the Japanese at Meiktila and Mandalay was to prove decisive. The Japanese had again suffered huge casualties and lost a very high proportion of their remaining heavy equipment, artillery, and tanks. Without these resources, continuing the war against 14th Army's heavy armour, 14th Army heavy armour became almost impossible. In addition, the fall of Mandalay, a cultural centre of great significance to the local Burmese population, turned Burmese national opinion against the Japanese occupiers. While losing control of the river and road network north of Meiktila meant that the Japanese forces in northern Burma were now effectively cut off to wither on the vine, stopping any hope of their reinforcing the remaining troops in and around Rangoon in the far south. Thus, plans for the final conquest of Burma and the recapture of Malaya were now moved forward. Key to these plans, as mentioned, was the recapture of the city of Rangoon, now Yangon, by May and the onset of the monsoon rains, because these rains would damage or destroy many of the supply routes still being used by the 14th Army. And there were approaching deadlines for the return and withdrawal of American transport aircraft, which would hinder 14th Army's operations further. Our luck had certainly been pushed on various occasions up to that point. By early April, the 4th and 33rd Corps began their drive south, along the Irrawaddy and Sitang River valleys respectively. Despite facing remnants of the Japanese 33rd Army at Pawabwe in early April, and narrowly missing capturing the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Honda, his headquarters and staff into the bargain, British forces managed to outflank and defeat their opposition fairly handily, and effectively opened the road to Rangoon itself, some 300 miles further south. By April 25th, the 17th Division found itself pushing through scratch forces of mixed rear echelon troops, the last-ditch attempts of the Japanese in Rangoon to mount an effective defence. Unbeknownst to the British, General Kimura, the overall commander in Rangoon, had already ordered an evacuation to begin on April 22nd, seeing the writing on the wall. In parallel to these final advances, Slim had requested that an earlier amphibious landing plan for recapturing Rangoon itself, delightfully named Operation Dracula, should be reactivated. This would ensure that there was no risk of 14th Army being stuck in a dogged final grinding assault on the Japanese in Rangoon, using the site as a kind of final back-to-the-wall defence, whilst the monsoon rains bogged them down and prevented any further sort of assault. This, however, brought its own problems, as several airfields and coastal batteries needed to be captured before seaborne troops could land. In particular, the mouth of the Rangoon River needed to be cleared of mines, and this could only be accomplished through the prior destruction of an artillery battery at a site called Elephant Point on the west bank of the river. Weather conditions prevented deploying troops by sea, and so an airdrop was planned, with troops drawn from across the available parachute units, including several companies from the relatively newly created and relatively untested 154th Gurkha Parachute Regiment, giving a nod to the fact there were in fact Gurkha parachutists in this theatre of the war. Despite logistical problems, on the 1st of May, the 154th Gurkha Parachute Regiment took part in this successful drop at Elephant Point, beginning in the early hours. Over 700 Gurkha parachutists landed on time and on target, and in fact progressed ahead of schedule through their objectives. The force managed to capture the last points of resistance by 15:30 hours that day, with the final Japanese bunker at Elephant Point falling to a Gurkha-led kukri and flamethrower assault. The Indian and Gurkha troops' actions at Elephant Point outperformed all expectations and removed the danger from the 26 Indian Division's intended landing from the sea to relieve Rangoon, thus allowing the remainder of Operation Dracula to proceed as planned. Troops from the 26th Indian Division began landing in the end of May 2nd without opposition, having seen earlier evidence of Japanese withdrawal, including a message painted on the roof of a local jail by Allied POWs, which read, quote, "Japs gone, extract digit." They were met by a joyful welcome from the locals, and many units began managing the chaos of the abandoned city. Others marched north to meet up with the lead units of the 14th Army. They met at the town of Lachhiman, some 28 miles northeast of Rangoon, on May 6, 1945. With the fall of Rangoon and the crushing of Japanese forces in central Burma, Japanese actions became confined to a series of shrinking and desperate defensive positions across the country, most notably in the far south, in a redoubt of hills known as the Pegu-Yoma Range, between the Irrawaddy and Sitang rivers. With the ability for Japanese forces to conduct defensive operations greatly neutralized, the Allied focus shifted to the next planned operation, the amphibious invasion and recapture of Malaya, today Malaysia, known as Operation Zipper. Not as good as Operation Dracula, in my opinion, but you can't win them all. Japanese forces were unable to link up and were effectively trapped in their positions, languishing wherever they were to be found. The remaining Japanese commanders in the Pegu-Yoma region aimed to make one final breakout attempt in July 1945 to link up with the remaining pockets of Japanese troops in the east of the Sitang River, and then retreat to that least known of the Axis powers, Thailand. The swollen Sitang River and the previous capture of the Japanese plans by a Gurkha patrol notwithstanding, the breakout attempt occurred throughout July in what became known as the Battle of the Sitang Bend. It proved to be a crushingly dismal failure for the Japanese. Their remaining forces suffered some 14,000 casualties, being easily attacked and channeled into killing zones by Allied artillery and forewarned positions of troops, as well as suffering serious and brutal attacks from vengeful Burmese partisans. This final battle, a strangely appropriate bookend to the disastrous Battle of the Sitang Bridge 3 years earlier, effectively rendered Japanese military forces in Burma finally inactive. It ended mere weeks before the final surrender of Japan. It is in the context of these mopping up operations from May onwards, although in an instance further to the north and west than the events of the Sitang Bend, that the recurrence of the events surrounding the final Victoria Cross for a Gurkha in Burma, and indeed the final Victoria Cross awarded to a Gurkha during the Second World War, that awarded to Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung of the 4th Battalion 8th Gurkha Rifles, occurred. Lachhiman Gurung was born at Dakakani in the Chitwan district of western Nepal. As with most Gurkhas of this era, his actual specific date of birth is not known, but his probable year of birth is 1917. He was recruited into the 8th Gurkha Rifles in 1941 and was fortunate to be so recruited because he stood at just under 5 foot in height. In peacetime, this would have meant a rejection as he didn't fulfill the requirements. But this was wartime and certain requirements were in fact relaxed. He is not the only Gurkha Victoria Cross recipient who got in based on these relaxations, although I can't go into full details here. Having passed his recruit training, Lachhiman was posted in March 1945 to the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, then in operations in Burma. In May 1945, the 4th Battalion was part of the 89th Indian Infantry Brigade in the 7th Indian Division, advancing south along the Irrawaddy River against pockets of retreating Japanese forces. On the 11th of May, B and C companies of this battalion were ordered to hold an important position astride a track on the west side of the river, near the small village of Tongdo. I've tried looking it up for coordinates, but it's so small on current Google Maps, I don't think I can find it. This track was vital to the Japanese withdrawal, and for 3 days and nights the Japanese fought with fanatical fury in an attempt to clear the track. They launched wave after wave of suicidal attacks to try and clear the positions, the key position of which was held by No. 9 Platoon of C Company. This platoon's position was almost 100 yards, or 300 feet, ahead of the remainder of the company, and the most forward position of this platoon was held by Rifleman Lachhiman's section. This was the situation where Rifleman Lachhiman earned his Victoria Cross. His citation in the London Gazette of the 27th of July 1945 reads as follows, quote, "At Tongdo in Burma, on the west bank of the Irrawaddy, on the night of 12-13 May 1945, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was manning the most forward post of his platoon. At 0120 hours, we're almost there, at least 200 enemy assaulted his company position. The brunt of the attack was borne by Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung's section and by his own post in particular. This post dominated the jungle path leading up to his platoon locality. Before assaulting, the enemy hurled innumerable grenades at the position from close range. One grenade fell on the lip of Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung's trench. He at once grasped it and hurled it back at the enemy. Almost immediately, another grenade fell inside his trench. He picked this one back up and threw it back. A third grenade then fell just in front of his trench, and he attempted to throw this one back also. Then it exploded in his hand, blowing off his fingers, shattering his right arm, and wounding him severely in the face, body, and right leg. His 2 comrades were also badly wounded and lay helpless in the bottom of the trench. The enemy, screaming and shouting, now formed up shoulder to shoulder and attempted to rush the position by sheer weight of numbers. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, regardless of his wounds, fired and loaded his rifle with his left hand, maintaining a continuous and steady rate of fire. Wave after wave of fanatical attacks were thrown in by the enemy, and all were repulsed with heavy casualties. For 4 hours after being severely wounded, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung remained alone at his post, waiting with perfect calm for each attack, which he met with fire at point-blank range from his rifle, determined not to give 1 inch of ground. Of the 87 enemy dead, counted in the immediate vicinity of his company's locality, 31 lay in front of this rifleman's section, which was the key to the whole positioning. Had the enemy succeeded in overrunning and occupying Lachhiman Gurung's trench, the whole of the reverse slope of the position would have been completely dominated and turned. This rifleman, by his magnificent example, so inspired his comrades to resist the enemy to the last that, although surrounded and cut off by a further 3 days and 2 nights, they held and smashed every Japanese attack. His outstanding gallantry and extreme devotion to duty, in the face of almost overwhelming odds, were the main factors in the defeat of the enemy. And the citation quote ends there. But as with many of the Gurkha BC citations and stories, there are certain stories that cannot be conclusively proved, but really very much add to the mythos of the story. And Lachhiman Gurung is no exception. The story that is added and told here is that despite his wounds and despite the overwhelming odds, Lachhiman Gurung, having been so wounded, drew his kukri and jammed it into the ground in front of his position and yelled out in Gurkhali, "Come on then, come and fight a Gurkha." Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was evacuated to hospital, but he lost his right hand and the use of his right eye. On 19th December 1945, He was decorated with the Victoria Cross by His Excellency the Viceroy of India, Field Marshal Lord Wavell, at the Red Fort in Delhi. His proud father, then aged about 74 and very, very frail, was carried for 11 days and nights from his village in Nepal to be present at the Red Fort to see him decorated. And it should be noted that the Chitwan district, even today in the west of Nepal, is very isolated. So 50, 60, well, 80 years ago now, it is practically inaccessible without days and days of travel. Lachhiman continued to serve with the 8th Gurkha Rifles, who remained in India after Indian independence in 1947. He was promoted to Havildar, the equivalent of sergeant, but retired on completion of his service and returned to his village in Nepal. One of his sons subsequently became an officer in the 8th Gurkhas, and Lachhiman himself died on December 12, 2010, in London, receiving medical treatment. The campaign in Burma, though not the largest land campaign against Japanese forces during the Second World War, may be seen as one of the most important. At points, it presented an existential threat to the British Empire and her allies, with an impending invasion of India, and it served as a proving ground for the new tactics and experience which would lead the 14th Army to turn the tide against Japanese forces in 1944. This army owed a huge amount of its strength to the Indian and Gurkha soldiers it contained, who played more and more of a role as the war progressed. The 14th Army, in which the majority of these Gurkhas fought, has been referred to as the Forgotten Army, due to the perceived overlooking of the Far Eastern theatres of World War II in favour of those in Europe and North Africa. However, more Gurkha soldiers would serve in Burma than in any other theatre of the war, and the jungle experience they gained would provide the foundation for nearly 2 decades of Cold War jungle fighting in Malaya and Borneo. It is almost impossible to speak of the Gurkhas in the Second World War without referring to their experiences in Burma, and their continued service to Britain to this day has been irrevocably and deservedly coloured by their fighting to reclaim Burma from the Japanese. I will hand back over to Daren to conclude.
So to conclude, I would just like to say a few words about Project Qaida, our redevelopment project, which will help us to even better commemorate and recognise Gurkha service, not just in the Second World War, but over more than 2 centuries and continuing today. Qaida is a Nepali word meaning ethos, heritage and tradition. Ours is a good, small military museum, but Project Qaida, a £5.2 million redevelopment, will create both a must-see visitor destination and secure our place as the global reference point for Gurkha heritage. It will see the development of our old and shabby library into a research and education space. Indeed, that's already completed, and that is from where we're talking to you this evening. Our public galleries, over 2 floors, will be stripped out entirely and remodelled, including a dramatic 2-storey representation of a Gurkha messing fire, from around which visitors will be able to call up voices from the past and the present. It will be more accessible, more amenable to intergenerational visits, including school and community groups. It will add in some missing stories, those of the families, of the non-infantry units. Much more of it will be in Nepali as well as in English, making it more welcoming to the Nepali diaspora here in the UK. And it will bring the story up to date. The third element is to digitise our extensive archive, making it globally accessible. And finally, but by no means least, we will have an extensive outreach and engagement programme. Do please have a look at our website to find out more. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I hand back to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. As I like to say quite often, I know I learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure my at-home audience learned a lot tonight. Now is when we are going to open up for our Q&A from our at-home audience. So audience, if you have any questions, please type those into the comment section. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with one because it's a question we discussed earlier. So I think they already have answers ready to go for it. So, is there something you wish more people knew or understood about the Gurkha?
I think from my perspective, it would be the length of that incredible and loyal service. The fact that it is over 200 years now that Gurkhas have been serving Britain, and that they have done so steadfastly with so much gallantry and without a shadow of a doubt, incredibly loyally.
Yeah, I would also add to that Gurkhas are still recruited, which many people we speak to don't appreciate, but also the effect on British society that the Gurkha contribution has made. The number of British Nepalis in the UK now stands at over 130,000. And in recent years, Nepali has become the second most common first language in the county of Hampshire, where we're based. They are not simply in the military, but in all walks of life across the UK more broadly, and we're incredibly grateful for that. But Britain would not be the same without them.
Okay, we have some comments coming in that I will share with you guys. So the first one we have is that from Yvonne, her father served in this theater and often spoke of his experiences, the people in the land. Very cool. From Peter, he says, "Well done, gentlemen, and thank you for the time zone accommodation."
We aim to please.
Next we have, oh, it looks like Colin may have visited you before. He says, "Excellent museum to visit when in the UK."
Thank you.
It'd be even better to read about it.
And then John says, "Absolutely fantastic presentation. I learned so much. Very brave men." And then the last one I have down here that's been starred is excellent presentation. Thank you from San Antonio, Texas.
Thank you.
Let's see. Colin also says something about the Gurkha Welfare Trust, and that is also a good organization to support. Is that something you guys are familiar with?
Yes, we work very closely with the Gurkha Welfare Trust. It's a rather different organisation in scale and wealth, but it's an important part of Britain's giving back to Nepal and to our Gurkha veterans.
From Douglas, says, "Where is your museum located in England?"
We are based in the city of Winchester in the county of Hampshire in the south of the country. It's a wonderful city, very historic, over 1,000 years of history. And we are not the only military museum. We occupy an old barracks site that was decommissioned in the end of the 1980s. And there are 5 other military museums on site. So if you're ever in the UK and this part of the world, we're overflowing with things to do. Do drop in and give us a visit. Although not in the next year or so, because we will be closing in a few months to completely redevelop. So
although we will be maintaining a space open with temporary exhibitions.
This is true.
And if you are going to be in the UK, aim to be here at the end of a month, because on the last Friday of every month, we do a fantastic Nepali curry lunch.
It is delicious.
Well, that sounds great. That's awesome. Okay, so for my at-home audience, so that you guys know, earlier I was talking with our guests and I told them about how I had discussed with our living history coordinator that we were doing a special presentation on the Gurkha tonight, and he said, "I'll be right back." And then he ran down to our education outreach collection, which is located at the Pacific Combat Zone. That is where we keep the artifacts that we use to help with our living history programs, our outreach programs, our outpost programs. It's the artifacts that we can take out so that students of all ages can learn a little bit more about history in a more hands-on manner. So he went down to the EOC, as we call it, and then he ran back up and he said, "Look at this." So I'm gonna hold it up for everybody, and then I'm gonna ask the guys to talk about it for a second. So this is what our living history coordinator brought up from our education outreach collection. And guys, can you give everybody a little bit of detail about this piece?
Yeah, how would you do so? So what you are holding there is the iconic knife, or sort of the long machete or decent sized knife that is used by Gurkha soldiers and by many others in Nepal and northern India and has been for generations, known as the kukri. It is designed as a tool as well as a weapon. There are various myths around it that it cannot be drawn without tasting blood. If a Gurkha soldier were to do this, they'd collapse for lack of blood loss. Well, collapse from blood loss within the first couple of hours of use. Its effectiveness as a tool and a weapon, and as a largely unchanged sidearm for British Gurkhas from 200 years ago to today, talks about its effectiveness. The piece that you have there also contains 2 smaller knives, which usually come alongside a standard issue kukri. These are known as the chakmak, which is a small, rather blunt blade, which is used for sharpening, and the karda, which is a smaller, detailed kind of penknife piece used for detail work. What we have there, we sort of discussed this earlier, it's very difficult to be totally certain at kind of long range because there are a bewildering array of different variations in kukris, from size to shape to stamps to era to different battalions would make their own. But that, I would suspect, given its provenance as potentially a service piece, is either going to be a Mark II or Mark III kukri dating from the Second World War. To date, there have been about 5 Marks, or British service kukri versions of kukris. The first one turned up in the First World War, and they were absolutely huge. Then I've gone through up to the Mark V, which exists and is used today. Interestingly, the Mark IV really was only in existence for about 2 years. I only made about 1,500 of them, and it was made by Wilkinson Sword, the company that makes swords and razor blades. So it didn't prove very popular because, oddly enough, it was too high quality. Once it lost its edge, it was very difficult to resharpen when you were in the middle of a jungle. So the design was rapidly retooled and moved back out to India and Nepal.
And I think, just to add to that, it is the iconic imagery of the Gurkha. Every Gurkha regimental badge, our own museum badge, you may be able to see, has crossed kukris on it. And just sadly to burst the bubble of that myth that whenever drawn, it must taste blood. As Doug says, if that was true, most Gurkhas would be covered in cuts because it's a utility knife. It's not just for decapitating the enemy.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes, no need to cut yourself, Lauren.
So our next question, our next comment is: the Gurkha were known for their skills with their knife. Can you comment on this? So we've just talked about the kukri for a little bit, but is there anything you would like to add to their skill set about working with knives?
Well, I think we were discussing earlier, ceremonially on religious occasions, it is used traditionally for the decapitating of a water buffalo or a goat as at the beginning of religious festivities. And by tradition, if the decapitation doesn't happen in one blow, then it's bad luck. So it takes some skill to decapitate an animal with a knife, even with a heavy one. So they really are very skilled with it. There's also a thing that has emerged. It's a tradition, but it's a relatively recent one of the kukri pattern. This is soldiers demonstrating the moves with the kukri in the form almost of a dance, and that now features very heavily in any Gurkha celebration. I think I've even seen them face off against the New Zealand rugby team, the haka against the kukri pattern. I know which one I'd rather be facing.
It's also worth noting that in the UK, the Brigade of Gurkhas based in the UK, due to sort of noting animal rights rules and laws, those animals tend to be replaced with symbolic vegetables such as marrows in the UK. Although in Nepal it does still happen, but that is not, in case anybody watching was worried on that score.
Okay, we've got 2 more comments. One is from Mr. Al, fitting tribute to our unsung heroes. So thank you guys for your presentation. And then our last question is: did the Japanese have a special fear of the Gurkha?
Yes, it's the honest answer. Whilst you can take any particular group of soldiers and any particular nationality in World War II, and usually you'll find some sources that say this group scared this group more than any of the other, there does appear to be fairly substantial evidence that the Japanese were, oddly enough, alongside American Marines. They were fairly, they viewed them as pretty hard as nails. But yeah, Gurkhas, for their jungle craft and for their ability to meet the Japanese in the jungle on their own terms, pretty much right off the bat, definitely sort of scared the Japanese in terms of who they were facing. So that does appear to be substantially true.
I think it's because Gurkhas live up to that wonderful quote of Professor Sir Ralph Lilly Turner, bravest of the brave, most generous of the generous. Nepalis are incredibly warm, hospitable, friendly people, and Gurkha soldiers absolutely model that. But you really do want them on your side.
I can believe that, yeah. Okay, it looks like we are just about out of time for tonight, so I want to say a big thank you to you guys, especially staying up so late to be with us tonight.
Sorry,
We really appreciate that. All right, so thank you again for your very informative and detailed presentation and for helping me out with my kukri description. earlier. So thank you guys. For my at-home audience, I want to do a couple of reminders. Our next webinar that we have is going to be on May 21st, and it's all about FDR's stamp collection and kind of his impact on the mail system during World War II. That will be on Wednesday, May 21st at 1 p.m. And then next up, we do have a webinar in June coming up. This one is the Dixie Mission in China during World War II. We are going to be bringing back Mr. James Bevel, who gave a presentation last year. So we're very excited to have him back for our June webinar. That is going to be it for us tonight. Thank you again for joining us so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you.